June 4, 1942, 10:22 a.m. 240 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, the Pacific Ocean lay flat as hammered steel beneath a sky too clear for mercy. Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron's throat was dry. His hands, wrapped around the control column of his Douglas TBD Devastator, trembled not from fear, but from the weight of what he already knew. 15 torpedo bombers from Torpedo Squadron 8 had launched from the USS Hornet an hour before dawn. Now, at 10,000 feet, they flew alone. No fighter escort, no dive bombers overhead, no friendly voice on the radio. Below them, the entire combined fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy carved white wakes across the blue, and Waldron had just given the order that would kill them all. The Devastator was not mocked because it was slow. It was mocked because it was obsolete, and everyone knew it. Designed in 1934, adopted in 1937, it had entered service in an era when biplanes still patrolled carrier decks and the notion of a Pacific War seemed distant and theoretical. By the spring of 1942, the TBD was a relic. Its maximum speed, 115 miles per hour with a torpedo slung beneath its belly, made it slower than most Japanese fighters by nearly 200 miles per hour. Its range was short. Its defensive armament consisted of one forward-firing 30-caliber machine gun and a single 30-caliber swivel gun manned by the radio man in the rear seat. Its armor was negligible. Most damning of all, the Mark 13 torpedo it carried was so unreliable that more than half refused to detonate even when they struck their targets. Pilots joked bitterly that the Devastator's only real threat was to the men who flew it. But on the morning of June 4, 1942, there was no other choice. The Japanese First Air Fleet, 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and a screen of destroyers was steaming toward Midway, with the intent to draw out and annihilate the remaining American carrier force.
In the Pacific. If successful, Japan would dominate the ocean from Alaska to Australia, and the road to Hawaii, perhaps even the American West Coast, would lie open. The United States had exactly 3 carriers in the region: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the latter still smoking from damage sustained at the Battle of the Coral Sea a month prior. Admiral Chester Nimitz, operating with intelligence broken from Japanese naval codes, had positioned his carriers northeast of Midway in a calculated ambush. The plan depended on surprise. The plan depended on striking first. The plan depended on men like John Waldron flying aircraft that should have been retired 2 years earlier. Waldron was 39 years old, a South Dakotan of Sioux heritage, a man who spoke little and prepared obsessively. In the weeks leading up to Midway, he had drilled his squadron relentlessly, not in tactics of evasion or survival, but in the single-minded geometry of the torpedo run: straight, low, and slow. He had told his men privately that if they ever got separated from the group, they should fly directly toward the Japanese carriers, because that was where the war would be won or lost. He had written a final letter to his wife the night before, sealed and left in his footlocker. He knew what was coming. They all did. At 10:24 a.m., Waldron's squadron descended through the clouds and saw them. The Kido Butai, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, arrayed in a box formation 30 miles across. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had ravaged Darwin, that had driven the British from the Indian Ocean. Their decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled for a second strike against Midway. Waldron did not hesitate. He pushed his stick forward and dove. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol responded immediately. Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, sleek and deadly, peeled away from their stations above the fleet and fell upon Torpedo Squadron 8 like wolves on wounded deer. The Zeros did not need to maneuver. They did not need to be clever. They simply flew up behind the lumbering Devastators and fired. One by one, the American planes exploded or cartwheeled into the sea. Waldron's aircraft was hit within 2 minutes. Witnesses aboard the Japanese carriers would later report seeing the lead American plane trailing smoke, its engine sputtering, before it nosed over and struck the water in a white eruption of spray. There were no parachutes. Within 6 minutes, all 15 Devastators were gone. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the water for 30 hours before rescue, hidden from Japanese eyes by a floating seat cushion. Torpedo Squadron 8 never landed a single hit. Their sacrifice seemed meaningless. The Japanese sailors, watching from their decks, laughed. They shouted insults in Japanese that the Americans would never hear. They called the Devastators canvas-winged coffins. They mocked the audacity of sending such outdated machines against the finest naval air arm in the world. Officers aboard the Akagi commented to one another that the Americans were brave but foolish, still clinging to the obsolete doctrines of battleship warfare while Japan had perfected the art of carrier aviation. There was a sense, palpable and poisonous, that the United States had already lost this war, that the industrial power and democratic softness of America could not stand against the Bushido spirit and tactical brilliance of the Emperor's forces. But the laughter died at 10:26 a.m. Torpedo Squadron 8 had done more than die. They had pulled the entire Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. Every Zero that had been circling at altitude, waiting to intercept American dive bombers, had descended to massacre the torpedo planes. For 6 crucial minutes, the sky above the Japanese carriers was empty, and into that emptiness came 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, unnoticed, unengaged, and perfectly positioned. The Dauntless was not mocked. It was not slow. It was not obsolete. It was, in fact, the most lethal carrier-based aircraft in the world, and the men who flew it had trained for years in the brutal mathematics.
Of the dive-bombing attack, a 60-degree dive from 14,000 feet, airspeed building toward terminal velocity, the target growing in the bomb sight until the last possible second, then the violent pullout that grayed vision and tested the airframe's limits. The SBD carried a single 1,000-pound bomb, and in the hands of a skilled pilot, it could place that bomb within a 50-foot radius from 2 miles up. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, leading the Enterprise dive bombers, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour. His fuel was running low. His pilots were growing anxious. But McClusky had noticed a lone Japanese destroyer steaming northeast at high speed, the Arashi, racing to rejoin the fleet after hunting an American submarine. McClusky followed its wake, and at 10:20 a.m. he found them. He radioed his squadrons, split his forces, and assigned targets. Then he rolled inverted and dove. The first bomb struck the Akagi at 10:26 a.m., punching through the wooden flight deck and detonating in the hangar bay where 18 fully fueled and armed aircraft were being prepared for launch. The explosion was not singular. It was a cascading chain reaction. Aviation fuel ignited, torpedoes cooked off, bomb magazines erupted. Within seconds, the hangar became a blast furnace. Sailors were incinerated where they stood. Damage control parties, rushing toward the fires, were consumed by secondary explosions. The ship's superstructure buckled. Captain Taijiro Aoki, standing on the bridge, watched his command disintegrate and knew immediately that the Akagi would not survive. 1 minute later, the Kaga took 3 direct hits in rapid succession. The first bomb destroyed the forward elevator, trapping dozens of men below decks. The second ignited fuel lines on the flight deck, creating a river of fire that swept aft and consumed parked aircraft. The third penetrated deep into the ship's bowels and detonated near the aviation ordnance magazine. The Kaga's captain, Jisaku Okada, ordered the magazine flooded, but it was too late. The explosion tore the carrier apart from within, lifting the flight deck like a steel blanket and hurling wreckage 300 feet into the air. 30 seconds after that, the Soryu absorbed 3 bombs in the span of 4 seconds. 1 hit aft, obliterating the flight deck crew. 1 hit amidships, detonating in the hangar among fueled bombers. 1 hit forward, near the bridge, killing the captain and most of the senior staff instantly. The Soryu was the smallest of the Japanese carriers, and the damage was catastrophic. Fire spread so rapidly that within 10 minutes, the entire ship was engulfed.
Survivors, leaping into the ocean, looked back to see their ship transformed into a floating pyre, black smoke towering thousands of feet into the tropical sky. 3 carriers, 6 minutes. The math was simple. The consequence was unthinkable. The Japanese had entered the battle with 4 fleet carriers and 421 operational aircraft. They had absolute confidence in their tactical superiority, their pilot skill, their technological edge. They had won every major engagement since Pearl Harbor. They had never lost a carrier. And now, in less time than it took to boil water, 3 of their 4 flat tops were burning uncontrollably. Their decks too warped to launch or recover aircraft, their crews abandoned in ship or dying in the flames. The 4th carrier, Soryu, managed to launch a desperate counterattack that crippled the Yorktown, but by late afternoon, American dive bombers found her too. She burned through the night and sank the following morning. The Battle of Midway ended on June 7, 1942. Japan lost 4 carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 men. The United States lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. The balance of naval power in the Pacific shifted irrevocably. Japan would never again mount a major offensive operation. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully constructed through 6 months of unbroken victories, collapsed in 6 minutes above a flat blue sea. But the story the world remembers, the story of the dive bombers, the perfect attack, the miraculous timing, is incomplete without the men who made it possible. Torpedo Squadron 8 did not sink a single ship. They did not damage a single target. They died to the last man, flying aircraft the Navy knew were death traps, executing a tactic that had no chance of success. And yet their sacrifice was not futile. It was essential. They forced the Japanese to react. They pulled the defensive umbrella down to the waterline. They created the opening that McClusky's dive bombers exploited. Waldron had told his men that the war would be won or lost at the carriers. He was right. He simply did not live to see it. In the weeks following Midway, American war correspondents and historians struggled to make sense of what had happened. The official Navy report described the battle as a decisive victory, but the language was clinical, stripped of the human cost. Pilots who survived the battle spoke in quiet tones about the men who had not. George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was debriefed extensively. He described watching his squadron die around him. He described the Zeros, black against the sun, making pass after pass. He described the moment his own plane was hit, the sensation of the aircraft shuddering apart beneath him, the cold shock of the Pacific as he plunged through the surface. He described floating for 30 hours, hidden from Japanese destroyers by a rubber seat cushion, watching the American dive bombers arrive and listening to the explosions as the carriers burned. When he was finally rescued, he weighed 20 pounds less than when he had launched. He was awarded the Navy Cross. He never spoke publicly about Midway for the rest of his life. The Japanese, meanwhile, entered a period of profound psychological disorientation. The loss of 4 carriers was catastrophic in material terms, but the spiritual impact was worse. The Kido Butai had been the symbol of Japanese naval supremacy, the proof that a small island nation could dominate an ocean. Its destruction at Midway shattered that narrative. Japanese officers who had mocked American equipment and tactics now faced an uncomfortable truth. The United States had outfought them with inferior aircraft, fewer carriers, and a hastily assembled defensive plan. The laughter that had echoed across the decks of the Akagi and Kaga on the morning of June 4th was replaced by silence, the silence of men realizing that the enemy they had underestimated was not soft, not weak, not incapable of learning and adapting and fighting with a ferocity that matched their own. There was a recurring image that haunted the survivors of the Japanese carrier fleet, an image that appeared in letters, diaries, and post-war interviews. It was the image of the American torpedo bombers, slow and outdated, flying directly into annihilation without wavering. Japanese pilots, interrogated after the war, spoke with a mixture of contempt and reluctant admiration. They called the Devastator crews samurai in tin cans, men who had embraced certain death with the same fatalistic courage that Japanese culture revered. But there was a critical difference. The Japanese samurai tradition emphasized death with honor as an end in itself. The American pilots who flew the Devastators did not seek death, they sought victory. Their willingness to die was not philosophical, it was tactical. They understood that their deaths might open a door for others to walk through. And they were right. The symbolism of the Devastator, slow, obsolete, mocked, yet essential, became a metaphor for the American war effort itself. In 1942, the United States was still mobilizing. Its military was a patchwork of pre-war equipment, hastily trained recruits, and outdated doctrine. The Japanese and Germans, by contrast, had spent years preparing for total war. They had battle-hardened armies, cutting-edge technology, and tactical experience that the Americans lacked. By every measure, the Axis powers should have won. But they did not account for the capacity of democratic societies to endure catastrophic losses, to learn from failure, to adapt and innovate under pressure. The Devastator was replaced by the Grumman TBF Avenger within months of Midway. The Mark 13 torpedo was redesigned and became one of the most reliable weapons in the Pacific theater. The tactics that failed so catastrophically on June 4th were studied, revised, and perfected. The men who died were not forgotten. Their names were written on new aircraft, new ships, new squadrons. The United States did not treat failure as dishonor. It treated failure as data. By 1943, American shipyards were producing one fleet carrier every 3 months. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had more carriers in the Pacific than Japan had possessed at the start of the war. The industrial capacity that Japanese strategists had dismissed as decadent and inefficient proved to be the single most decisive factor in the conflict. But that capacity was not merely material. It was ideological. American society, for all its flaws, had cultivated a culture that valued individual initiative, questioned authority, and rewarded innovation. The pilots who fought at Midway were not automatons following orders without thought. They were citizens in uniform, capable of making independent decisions under fire. Waldron had disobeyed direct orders when he broke away from the main formation to search for the Japanese carriers on his own. McClusky had gambled his remaining fuel on a hunch, following a lone destroyer's wake across an empty ocean. These were not the actions of men trained to obey blindly. They were the actions of men trained to think, to adapt, to take risks when the situation demanded it. That flexibility, that willingness to improvise, was something the rigidly hierarchical militaries of Japan and Germany could not replicate. The torpedo became the thread that ran through the entire narrative of Midway. It was a weapon designed to kill capital ships, to punch through armor and flooding compartments, to render even the largest warships helpless. But at Midway, American torpedoes failed almost universally. The Mark 13, plagued by faulty depth regulators and unreliable detonators, had a failure rate exceeding 50%. Pilots who survived their attack runs would watch their torpedoes strike enemy hulls and bounce off, or sink harmlessly into the deep, or explode prematurely in the water. The psychological toll was immense. Men risked their lives to deliver a weapon that did not work. And yet, the very act of attempting the attack, the commitment to fly low and slow through a storm of anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception, created the conditions for victory. The torpedo, in its failure, became a symbol of something larger. The willingness to commit fully to a course of action, even when success was uncertain, even when the odds were insurmountable, even when the cost was total. After Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy never recovered. The loss of 4 carriers was crippling, but the loss of trained pilots and deck crews was irreplaceable. Japan had entered the war with the finest naval aviators in the world, men who had trained for years in the demanding art of carrier operations. Those men died at Midway, and there was no system in place to replace them. The United States, by contrast, had already begun building a vast pilot training infrastructure, dozens of airfields across the continent, standardized curricula, thousands of instructors, a pipeline capable of producing tens of thousands of new pilots every year. By 1944, American carrier air groups outnumbered their Japanese counterparts by ratios of 10 to 1 or more. Quality gave way to quantity, and quantity, properly organized and supplied, became its own form of quality. The Japanese High Command, grappling with the disaster, imposed strict censorship on news of the defeat. The Japanese public was told that Midway had been a minor setback, a temporary reversal in an otherwise victorious campaign. Sailors who survived the battle were transferred to remote postings and ordered not to speak of what they had witnessed. Officers who questioned the strategic decisions that led to the defeat were reassigned or silenced. The official narrative held that Japan was still winning, still advancing, still destined for greatness. But the men who had been there, who had seen the carriers burn, who had watched the dive bombers fall from an empty sky, knew the truth. The war had turned. The momentum had shifted. The myth of invincibility had been a lie. In the United States, Midway was celebrated as a turning point, but the full story remained classified for years. The fact that American codebreakers had deciphered Japanese naval communications, giving Admiral Nimitz precise knowledge of enemy intentions and positioning, was a secret too valuable to reveal. The public was told that Midway had been won through courage and skill, which was true but incomplete. The intelligence advantage had been decisive. Without it, the American carriers might never have been in position to ambush the Japanese fleet. Without it, the gamble to defend Midway might have ended in catastrophic defeat. The code-breaking effort, led by a small team of cryptanalysts in Hawaii, represented another facet of the American approach to war. The willingness to invest in unglamorous, behind-the-scenes work that did not fit traditional notions of martial valor, but which proved essential to victory. The symbolic weight of the Devastator persisted long after the aircraft itself was retired. It appeared in training films, in propaganda posters, in memorial services. It became a shorthand for sacrifice, for the willingness to fight with inadequate tools, for the idea that victory was not always achieved by the strongest or the fastest, but by those who refused to quit. The image of a lone torpedo bomber laboring through hostile skies toward an enemy fleet became an icon of American determination. It was not triumphant, it was not glorious, but it was honest. Veterans of Midway, interviewed decades later, struggled to articulate what the battle had meant. They spoke of fear, exhaustion, chaos. They spoke of friends who had died, of aircraft that had disintegrated, of ships that had burned. They did not speak of glory. They did not speak of heroism in the abstract. They spoke of doing what needed to be done because there was no one else to do it. They spoke of flying obsolete planes because those were the planes they had. They spoke of pressing the attack even when the outcome seemed hopeless because the alternative, turning back, giving up, accepting defeat, was unthinkable. This was not ideology in the propagandistic sense. It was something quieter and more durable. The belief that their cause was just, that their sacrifice mattered, that the world they were fighting for was worth preserving. The epilogue of Midway is not a single moment, but a cascade of consequences that rippled across the remainder of the war. The Japanese Navy, forced onto the defensive, would fight brilliantly in isolated battles, but could never again threaten American strategic objectives. The United States, emboldened by victory, accelerated its offensive operations across the Pacific, island hopping toward the Japanese home islands with methodical, grinding efficiency. The pilots who survived Midway went on to fight at Guadalcanal, at the Philippine Sea, at Leyte Gulf. Many of them did not survive the war, but they had seen, in those 6 minutes above the Kido Butai, what was possible when desperation and skill and luck converged. They had learned that wars were not won by the side with the best equipment or the most experienced troops, but by the side that could endure loss, adapt to failure, and continue fighting when every rational calculation suggested surrender. There is a final detail, small and easily overlooked, that captures the essence of Midway.
In the wreckage of the Akagi, recovered decades later by deep-sea explorers, divers found fragments of American aircraft. Twisted aluminum, shattered instruments, pieces of a Devastator's tail section. The debris had fallen onto the carrier's deck during the attack, and when the ship sank, it carried those fragments down with it, 2 miles to the ocean floor. The Japanese had laughed at the Devastator that morning. They had called it slow, obsolete, a relic of a bygone era. But in the end, pieces of that relic lay atop the wreckage of their finest warship, a quiet testament to the men who had flown it and the impossible thing they had accomplished. The laughter had died, the carriers had burned, and the war, irrevocably, had changed.